I made it 11 minutes into this show before I googled, when does the dad die? So I think that showed a lot of self-restraint on my part. Hello, I'm Jenna, and today you're watching another WWM Productions video, and today I'm reviewing the semi-new release on Netflix, Sweet Tooth. It's a 8-episode post-apocalyptic drama, and it released last Friday, I believe June 4th? I think that's a date. I found Sweet Tooth to be an intriguing, hopeful, thrilling, and yes, occasionally sweet story of humanity and family. And I'm actually gonna synopsize the show for you, which I normally don't do because I forget. So Sweet Tooth follows the world after a plague-like event 10 years ago that wiped out huge numbers of humanity. It was like this terrible disease called the Sick, and just so many people died. And then at the same time, all the babies that were born after like a certain time were born half human, half animal. They were called hybrids. So the world kind of just went crazy. No one really knew what was happening, and the show picks up 10 years later after this great crumble, and it follows this hybrid deer human child named Gus and his father as they live in the woods, and something happens that forces Gus out of the woods after something happens to his father with this new companion called Jeopard. And Jeopard kind of has like a checkered past. He's done bad things before, but Gus just keeps following because he's the first human that he's seen in like 10 years other than his dad. And they go off in this kind of uneasy alliance to find Gus's mother in Colorado. This show is really interesting because it does the thing I like where it follows more than one perspective and it jumps around a little bit and plays with time and the story, because it weaves together this wide array of characters in a way that just satisfies me every time when it's done right. I love like ensemble casts, and Sweet Tooth has a great one. We also see the Singhs, which is a husband and a wife, Aditya and Ronnie, as they kind of live in this post-apocalyptic suburbia, and you're introduced to them and they're living together, and Ronnie is sick with this disease, but they've been able to get her treatments, allow her to live in remission for these 10 years, and it's kind of a miracle. And Dr. Singh, he has to wind up taking the place of the doctor that's been helping them with the treatments, and he is tasked with finding a cure. But of course, there's a dark underbelly to this and the community they live in. And you're first introduced to these characters, and you're like, wow, them and their community, they really figured everything out, and then that only lasts like one episode, and then you get to see what lies beneath this community, and it's, ooh. You follow the Animal Army, which is a group of teenagers who don't have anywhere else to go, and their purpose is to try and protect the hybrid. Then in the middle of it you have Amy, who is a therapist before the crumble, but once the crumble occurs, she is able to break free of her life and find purpose in it by forming this place called the Preserve that allows for the protection of hybrids. So you have all of these different stories, and they all coalesce into one in such a satisfying way, and I just thought this show was really great. It is definitely reminiscent of a few different titles that I could think of off the top of my head, but it uses the similarity to its advantage because it's just still so intriguing, and it does everything in a slightly new way that I didn't feel like I was looking at something I'd already seen before. This was something that I could really enjoy on its own without drawing comparisons to anything else. Like, each character kind of had like their own take on the main themes of the story, which I found to be really interesting, because instead of having like a one-touch story where it's like, okay, we're looking at this theme through this perspective, they're like, we're taking this theme and we're looking at it from all of these different angles, which again, I always really like, because there are so many different sides to one story, and this show gets that. And again, they start the story over like 5 times because it's like, depending on where you look at the story, it begins like this. And just, again, I just think that was a really clever way of doing this, especially when you have to introduce so many characters and keep that timeline connected to each other and making sure everything fits perfectly. And it's just so satisfying to see it. And I'll get into the end stuff in a bit. What I really want to do is I want to dive into the themes and how the different characters play into it, because that was the thing that kept me staying here, because there were a lot of other things I enjoyed about this show. Like, for example, like, just looking at it, it was really great. I loved the world, because even though it technically is our world, it was still really great to look at, because it's 10 years after this post-apocalyptic event, and I love seeing, like, how does humanity go on, and seeing all of these different societies and groups and how they play off of each other. I touched on the suburbia kind of community, and that was so interesting, because at first you're like, oh, look at them go, and then they break out the gasoline in the matches, and you're like, oh my god, that's, you literally just went there. I won't spoil it for you, but you know, everybody deals with things in their own way. You know, sometimes little arson is how your community gets by in the apocalyptic plague. Again, it's so interesting to see all of that, and especially because nature plays such kind of like a background role in this. It's important, but it's never like, subtextually speaking, nature is pretty important to the themes of this story, so it's really interesting to see like how vivid everything is, and like the amount of times the characters are just walking around, and it's so pretty too. Like, I want to go walk around post-crumble Midwest. Like, it's just looked so nice, and you have vines everywhere, and just, I thought they did a really great job of like what would be realistic in this scenario, and I just really enjoyed being in this TV show world for a little bit. I never felt like it was a chore to get into this show. And there are a number of reasons. The writing was really smart. It left enough room for speculation, but also it wasn't too obvious, all of the things they were doing. There were definitely some moments where I was like, I did not see that coming, and I kind of don't appreciate it, but I also do. Again, that's finale territory. And again, I just really liked how they did everything. It wasn't a super complex story, but they definitely did a lot with what they had, and I appreciated that. And again, to get back to those characters, the characters are kind of like the beating heart of this story, and if the characters fell flat, then you could not save this show with anything else. It would be maybe like mediocre at best, but the characters are what elevates it and made me enjoy it so much. And just to kind of like work from the inside out, Gus and Jeff were kind of the emotional core of the story. Seeing their relationship as kind of like father and son, I guess, they were just friends, grow is essentially like a given. Like, you can kind of like look at the small little plot Netflix gives you or the trailer and be like, huh, really wonder what they're gonna do with this. And you see this a lot in other media that's slightly similar in source as this one, but again, like, I love that kind of like grumpy, jaded, older person in the apocalypse who's done questionable things to survive, comes into the contact of this child ward that is slightly innocent in some capacity and doesn't know that much of the world, and having to take them under their wing and protect them. I love that story. Like, I'm sorry, you could do it a bunch of different times and I will still like eat that up. It's great. So seeing these two like learn to like trust each other and bouncing off of each other and teaching them different things was just really great to see, and it speaks to whether we see ourselves as worthy of love and who we believe that we can get that love from, or who we can give it to, and just our humanity and whether or not we're worth redemption and who kind of defines all of that. Just, they did a really great job with these two is what I'm trying to say. I loved seeing, like, they gave them the time and space they needed. They didn't try to rush it. They didn't, like, say, like, oh, like, because the audience knows. Like, you don't look at the story and be like, oh, they're not gonna, like, become, like, this duo that we always expect them to do. Like, I'm sorry, that was never a question for me. For me, the question was, how are they going to do it? And they just did it in such a satisfying way, and I love to kind of see, like, their little family like grow and yes, so great to see. And they were kind of like the baseline too of like two different people who have lost people and are going through their own things kind of come together to make a family, and kind of what we define as family. Like found family, if you like found family, you need to watch this show. They do found family so well. And to kind of counter that, I mentioned before that like Dr. Singh kind of became my unexpected favorite character of the show, and that is totally true. Like I went into this being like, oh yeah, like Gus and Jeopard, like we're gonna have that like family dynamic between the two of them and I'm gonna love it, and I did love it. But I also loved Dr. Singh as a character. He was really cool. I liked how they did his character and his relationship with his wife Ronnie as well. And I was like, yes, you see like communication and like, oh, they were a power couple. Like their characters complemented each other so well, and I just loved them. And Dr. Singh kind of acts as a thematic foil to everybody else, but especially Gus and Jeopard, because ultimately he has found his family. He's maintained his family throughout all of this, and he hasn't really lost anyone important to him and the audience as a whole. I mean, I'm sure he's lost tons of people in his life, but to the audience, we don't know who those people are. I guess they just don't really matter. But his family and his wife, that's who he's fighting for, and unlike the rest of the characters who are fighting for family that they're finding throughout the show, he's fighting to maintain what he already has. When he is kind of thrust into this role where he's not only fighting for his family and trying to protect them out of love, he's also losing his humanity in the desperation of trying to do so. So it's this really interesting dynamic where on the one hand, like, his family supports him in trying to save themselves and everybody else, but at the same time, he feels like this huge range of guilt and desperation over he knows what he's doing isn't something he believes in and something that he thinks is right, but at the same time, he has no other option beyond what he's doing, and he's constantly fighting for this good in humanity and his family and the people, for his family and what he believes in, but at the same time, his choices are slowly getting, like, wiped away around him until finally he has, like, no other choice than to do this thing that he's been, like, regretting before he even does it throughout the show. So it's just so interesting to see that dynamic as well. And another really interesting character was Bear, who is a member of the Animal Army that I mentioned earlier. And it was also really interesting to see how the idea of family and community comes around to her as well, because it was interesting to see how she kind of formed this family after she lost the family that she knew when all of the crumbling went down. So she formed her own family, and on the basis of what else we see in the story, you would think, oh, well, that's her family that she's going to be with the whole time, but you see that she kind of grows beyond this ideal that her family is built upon, and she grows and matures a little bit, and because of that, the home that she made no longer fits her. She gets left behind, or she gets too far ahead of them, and she has to leave. And watching her quietly accept that her family that she thought she found no longer accepts her, while also finding a new one that does and fits her growth, while also rightfully mourning the families that she's lost all along the way, was really powerful. And she's someone who, like, fights fiercely for the people she loves, even if they are no longer around to be with her, and also being left behind by them. Essentially, every time the worst in humanity does something to her family or to her, like, it's, like, I had this realization, like, way after I finished watching the show, that, like, every family she's ever had, she's had to leave in some capacity, whether or not they left her or she had to leave them. Like, she keeps losing everyone throughout the show, but yet she still fights for them, and she still fights for the good in people, which is just amazing to think about. It's almost like she is a type of hybrid herself. See what I did there? To round out our characters, we have Amy, who I have the least amount to say because her story is pretty, like, straightforward, and she grows throughout the show, and I still really liked her story with the preserve. I just don't have as much to say about it, and maybe that just also speaks to, like, me and my experiences, but I still really liked it, and especially seeing her, like, fight so hard to defend her home, even while she knows that the people who made it her home are escaping. It was just really great to see, and I loved all of her different monologues over the radio. It was really interesting to see how Amy was only able to come into her own once the whole rest of the world had to crumble around her, and how her redemption wasn't that she lost her humanity doing something bad. It was almost as if they were trying to draw the comparison that, like, she wasn't really living at all, and that, like, it's not that she wasn't human, it's just that she didn't have all of these intensely human experiences, like love and, like, deep familiar relationships and all of this, because she was only able to find this once everything happened, and she made her own family of people that she loves and people that love her. And again, just all of that was really great to see, and, like, the show was so great with how they did everything, because no storyline is, like, repeated or feels monotonous, and even though all of the different lines they have intersect in great ways, it's so wonderful to see how everything could be so different, but all still tied together to make the web that is this show. I was watching the finale, and, you know, partway through, something happened, and I was ready to throw hands, but, you know, it ended, and I was like, okay, this is, we're good now. You know, you almost had me in the first half, but then we came back in the second. I always love it when a writer can go, okay, so we have all these people, and we know they're going to come together, but then you make it, when they come together, essentially one of those glass revolving doors, where a bunch of people can come in one way, and then they come out the other way, but you all get kind of mixed together, and you all come out at different times, and you go off in different places. I love when an author or a writer can take that idea and just spit it out into the world, and essentially just wreak havoc on the story that you've already created in the narrative that you were pushing throughout the extent of one bit of your story, because I needed season 2 of this show like yesterday. Overall, this is a really well-crafted show, and there's a lot to piece over, and I think everyone will kind of walk away with their own thoughts about it because the themes are so rich. Really, the reason why I stayed so long were, like, the characters and the world and all of the different ideas, and I'm just excited to see where they go next with this story, because it was so interesting and intriguing, and I had a fantastic time watching it. And it's so offbeat and charming, and even though there are definitely some chilling moments, it's also just very sweet, and even at times wholesome to watch all of these different characters and how love and family survives after something so horrible. And don't get me wrong, while there are a lot of parallels you can draw to the COVID-19 pandemic, I think that only makes it more interesting, and also it just makes it a time to watch, on top of all of the animal human children. So just sit down, turn on Netflix, you don't know what to watch? I recommend Sweet Tooth. Let's give it like a 9 out of 10. Also, is no one going to talk about how the main villain in this story is literally just a skinny Dr. Eggman?